Love is in the air.
Is it really?
Or it's just like humidity. Welcome to the Life Plus God podcast. My name is Alyssa Robinson, and Denise Robinson is back, and we are in our final episode of this little mini series on heroes, villains, and love stories. And the only thing we have left to cover is what are the best love stories in the Bible?
Oh,
which is a harder question than
I was going to say. People probably are thinking, "Oh, yay," and I'm like, "Oh no."
Yeah. Because when you actually start digging into the stories that you had always thought of as love stories, you kind of realize that there's a lot of ickiness in the Bible that reading it through 2023 eyes, can't call it love.
Although I will say that any love story has messiness in it. And that's probably part of why it's compelling to us.
Right, but not every love story has victimhood in it.
No, that's true.
And that's a lot of the Bible love stories.
That's
quote,
true.
Air quote, love stories.
There you go.
What is your favorite love story? Not just in the Bible, but like, what is just your favorite love story and why?
Well, I have a go-to movie that's my favorite, which is called Shall We Dance? And it's a favorite of me because it has a little bit of the messiness. It has dancing, obviously, and it has Richard Gere. And so all the elements of a good love story and a marriage that stays together even through messiness. Mm-hmm. So I like that. But my favorite love story of all time is my parents' love story. My parents have a beautiful love story, and it also is filled with messiness, and yet it's beautiful. And so it's just anytime I think of a love story, I think of their story. We could do an entire podcast on their story, which we're not going to do. But what about you?
Yeah, I think so. When I was younger, I think that the love story I romanticized the most was The Notebook. Like, I loved that. And I think a lot of the elements of The Notebook actually reminded me of Grandmom and Granddad. Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell y'all in case y'all don't know. Denise is my mom, so her mom and dad are were my grandmom and granddad.
It now makes sense.
Yeah. So I loved that story and it came out when I was in high school, and it really struck me, and I read the book and all of that, and I absolutely loved it. I think as an adult, the love stories that I gravitate more toward are not romantic love. It is the long-lasting friendship love that you just see between couples. And this isn't a romantic love story at all, but one of my favorite twists was in the movie Frozen, when, traditionally in Disney movies, it's always been love's true kiss, an act of pure love that saves someone from a horrible fate. And Frozen turned that narrative on its head and said it doesn't have to be romantic love. And the story ends with it was the love between two sisters.
And I remember even sitting in the theater for the first time, not having heard anything about it, and going, "It's sister love," and having two daughters and watching the love y'all have for each other just really was emotional for me.
Well, and it was always up until that point, it felt like the majority of the time, the narrative was about a man swooping in to save a woman, and just seeing two strong women working together and their love persevering. It was a beautiful love story. So I don't want to limit love stories to romantic love at all. We are going to talk about some romantic love stories, but we're going to talk about some friendships as well. What do you think makes love stories so compelling? Why is it that we just... There will never be enough love stories written. You won't ever say, okay, we've told enough love stories.
I don't know the real reasons, but I mean, like the scientific, I'm sure they've done scientific studies and all of that on this because they do scientific studies for everything. But I honestly think that in some ways, day-to-day life is a little mundane and boring to a certain extent. Like, if you talk to somebody and say, "So what you been doing?" You can't think of a thing. But then the love stories, it's just like, this is something that we can, and I think it does something to our brains too. I think it might create something in our brain, some chemical in our brains that feels good. I think there's also danger in love stories too, because sometimes we idealize them and think that every relationship should be like a love story relationship, and every relationship is unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I learned that the hard way through my divorce. And I think it's because I had idealized what love was. And so I was seeing things in a person that weren't actually there because it's what society had told me to see in my significant other. And so I had this grand love story built up in my mind, and you have these certain steps that you're supposed to get through of like you start dating, and then you're official, and then you get engaged, and then you get married. And if you've been together for 3 years, 4 years, and you haven't moved forward in your relationship at all, then that's a problem. And so there were these certain steps that you were supposed to check off, which really surprised me that I fell into that, because I've always considered myself to be such like a strong, independent woman. But it's really hard to break away from societal norms around love.
Well, and I did the same thing on a different level, on a lesser level is, I watched my parents who were hand holders. They held each other's hand even when they were watching TV. They were always holding hands, and it was so sweet, and I grew up with that. And so when I started dating Chris, my husband, he never held my hand. And it really, at one point I started thinking, is this really, does he really care about me? And I finally got the nerve to ask him. And he said, well, I'm 6'4" and you're 5'6". It hurts my back to hold your hand. And it had never entered my mind that there was another alternative story. And so I let go, okay, our relationship doesn't have to look like anybody else's relationship.
Well, okay, so those societal norms, I kind of want to segue into the Bible a little bit here, because I think that one of the things that's really difficult for us, and I already mentioned it a little bit, is reading the Bible through our modern day lens. And so something that at a different time would have been perceived as a beautiful love story because of the way society was structured and the way that women were treated and all of this stuff is like we see as, man, like he's not even seeing her as a human, but...
Well, and I actually think people read it in the lens of this is a beautiful love story. They have
so?
They have to delve into it and realize, wait a minute, because I've had too many Bible studies and conversations where I've actually said, have you ever thought about the woman didn't have a choice in this? Oh, no, I just thought it was lovely and wonderful and beautiful. And it's like, no.
So what are some of those top of mind stories that like we often, before we dive into them, think of them as beautiful love stories, but then when you actually start to read it and use some critical thinking, you're like, wait a second, there's a lot of manipulation and evilness happening here.
So two come to mind. One is the story of Jacob and Rachel, and one is the story of Esther, actually. Those are two that come to my mind that people perceive as a beautiful love story, and there's so many more layers that are in there. Jacob and Rachel is in the book of Genesis, and Jacob himself was a master of deceit and manipulation, and then he gets deceived and manipulated by Rachel's father, Laban. And when you read scripture, it says in 3 places, it says, and Jacob loved her. It never says that Rachel had a choice in the union. It never says that Rachel loved him. She didn't have a choice. She was property, and Jacob loved her. Mm-hmm. But and it's a twisty-turny story that we probably won't go into now. But
well, and there are a lot of stories like this, and I think Jacob is one of them, but I'd have to go back and reread it, where it talks about love at first sight. And for men, that normally means I was very attracted to her, and so I fell in love with her, and what she thinks is irrelevant. And so that's a lot of this thing is like we have this idea of, oh, it was love at first sight. Well, for the majority of women, it's never love at first sight.
No, I mean, Jacob asked Laban, can I marry if I work for you for 7 years, can I marry your daughter, Rachel? And the dad says yes. He didn't turn. And we say, oh, that's so romantic. He loved her. We forget that they never turned to Rachel and said, do you want to marry this guy that you don't know, that, ran away because someone's trying to murder him? Or, I mean, they don't ask those questions.
Hopefully in the 7 years that he was working for her father, they got to know each other a little bit.
Perhaps,
maybe.
but then Laban did a quick switch, and who he actually married was her sister, her older sister. And he didn't know it until the marriage was consummated. So it's an interesting story.
Yeah, and that bothers me too. Is like we are like, oh my gosh, Jacob was deceived, and poor Jacob and poor Rachel, and he had to work another 7 years to get Rachel's hand. But poor Leah, being the older sister, married off to this guy, like she knows that, but like you said, who knows if Rachel actually had feelings for him or not. But my guess is that's not what she wanted to do. It was just part of like, you're supposed to marry off the oldest daughter first.
It was, and I honestly, I can't prove this, but I honestly believe that love wasn't in females' vocabulary. Then, except for the love for their children. But marriage was survival.
Yeah.
Having children was survival, because you were worth something if you bore children. And so I just felt like that we overlook that. I feel like people read it and they forget it was a different time.
But even if there's not love involved with Leah, like imagine the feeling of rejection of he marries you, finds out that you're not who he thought he was, and is immediately like, I don't want you.
Oh, and by the way, he didn't shun her. He had children with her.
Yeah.
Many.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like she was in a corner.
And then she had to stay in it, knowing that he didn't want to be with her.
Exactly.
Like, what an awful feeling.
Yeah. I mean, the sisters compete. It's really an interesting story. Is it a love story? Perhaps. One-sided? Perhaps.
Yeah.
I just think people read it and they get to the part where it actually says, and the 7 years went by so quickly because Jacob loved her. And the next 7 years went by so quickly because of Jacob's love for her. And they go, and they forget to look at the messiness that is around the story. Maybe we do that in real life too. Maybe we go, and forget that there's messiness.
Happy ending. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Esther too. So you think that, because Esther is one of the greatest love stories in the Bible, according to a lot of people. What qualms do you have with Esther?
So Esther was, in today's language, we would say she was sex trafficked. She was part of a harem. She was trying out to be queen, and trying out to be queen meant more than just doing a beauty pageant.
Yeah.
You had one night with the king, and if he decided, oh, this is the one, then so she was chosen to be queen. Yeah, that elevated her to a level of privilege that she didn't have before. But all the time, there's no choice in the matter. And even her uncle.
Well, and no doubt that the king did continue to keep his harem and concubines.
Yeah, the harem didn't go away.
Yeah.
And even in scripture, it says, at one point, she, without going into the whole story of Esther, at one point she needs to approach him, and she hadn't been with him for a long time. So it wasn't this loving, caring, mutual partnership.
See, and that I think that people think of it of a love story because of the way the king reacts to her, of like it's seen as he's pouring love on her by listening to her, by taking her feelings into consideration, all of these things. More likely, I feel like it was probably to save face. He didn't want his queen to be. It would be seen as a lack of power for his queen to be taken advantage of, and for her people to be diminished. When he's the ruler, he can't even protect his own queen.
Well, and he may have loved her, but it wasn't what we would think of a love story today.
It wasn't a partnership.
It wasn't a partnership. And I think that's really important to me in a love story is that there's a partnership and mutuality.
Yeah.
And this was not. This was a king and someone who was called in every once in a while.
Well, and that's another thing that bothers me about the book of Esther. I've been very vocal about that. So it's 4 chapters. It's named after Esther. You don't hear from Esther until chapter 4.
Yeah, I think it's more like 7 chapters, but that's okay.
Oh, sorry. Until the very end is the point that I'm making.
Yeah, she's in the middle of it. And then
Stop calling me out on my lack of Bible knowledge. No, but it's at the very end. You don't hear her speak. You don't hear anything from her. It's all men making decisions about her life. But the whole book is called Esther. And it's like, I think the whole book should be called Mordecai.
Yeah.
Because Mordecai is the one moving all of the pieces.
Yeah, Mordecai is her uncle. And he's actually the one that says, you need to do the beauty pageant to become a member of the harem. And so, it's a lot more complicated than we read because it's a great literary story and it's fun to read. I will tell you, it is fun to read. But when you read it, I think most people don't dig deep enough into the Bible stories to realize, there's more going on here and there's some icky stuff.
Well, I kind of feel that way about Song of Solomon as well, because that's one that we constantly turn to of like, oh my gosh, it's such beautiful love poetry. And it's very like, it's a scandalous book that a lot of churches don't cover because it's very sexual in nature. There's a lot of intimacy and turned into poetry and all of this. But when you know anything about King Solomon, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Absolutely.
We have absolutely no idea how many different women this poetry is about and
we don't even know. I mean, it's even confusing when there's so many different interpretations of it on what the love is, because some of the love story may be one of his conquests who's in love with someone else. The love story may be her and someone else, or it may be Solomon. We just don't know. And everybody also interprets it the way they want to interpret it.
Yeah, and if you have 700 wives and 300 concubines, like how much intimacy can there really be? Like how much love can there really be? I mean,
many of those wives, and remember this, when we think about those times, many of those wives were wives for political reasons only. If I marry this princess from this country, that'll make us have better ties.
And we never spend any time in the same room.
Yeah. There are so many complexities that we just think of it as, so pretty. And people, like I said, in Song of Solomon, go read it. It's pretty steamy, but at the same time, people will pull a verse out and say, oh, this says never have premarital sex. Oh, this says love is beautiful and mutually. And so you can't,
it's one of those books that it is not necessarily a teaching book. It is poetry.
It's prose. Absolutely.
Very personal. And we're getting a glimpse into someone else's inner thoughts.
Yeah.
So do you know why that's in the Bible? Like why that was included?
I did. You didn't give me notes to research that.
Sorry. I'm just curious now.
I have researched it in the past, but at this particular moment, it is not coming back to me.
It just seems like an odd book to throw in the mix. So I'll let y'all research that in your own time.
Get back to us. Tell us what the all-knowing Google tells us about that.
Okay. And so the last one I want to bring up, and then I promise we're going to talk about like
real love
stories from the Bible, things that we think are more genuine. I think that people are starting to wake up to this one, but David and Bathsheba.
Yeah, this one fascinates me. This one absolutely fascinates me because I think what has happened over time, and I remember being taught this too, what happens over time is David is such a hero, and he's listed in Scripture as a man after God's own heart, and so people want to make him good in every aspect. Mm-hmm. The story of David and Bathsheba is despicable on David's part. And
he claims that it is.
So I remember being taught at one point, I remember this as a teenager being told, yeah, but Bathsheba wasn't
What
doing
was
things she was supposed to be doing.
Bathing on the roof. She was a temptress. She was drawing in and trying to seduce David, and he fell victim to her charm.
Yeah, and it's all about power. First of all, David
he was already king at this point,
right? He was already king, and he was wandering on his roof, which overlooked the entire city. And so he was looking down. And so he looked down and he saw a beautiful woman bathing in her courtyard. Now, first of all, here's what you need to know.
He was a peeping Tom.
Well, we think of bathing as what we think of now. And what it really was because it tells us later that it was ritual cleansing, which means she wasn't even disrobed. More than likely,
it was like a religious ceremony.
It was, which you had to do at the end of your menstrual cycle. And so she was cleaning herself, and it wouldn't have been this hot tub experience or this sultry sticking her beautiful toe
like
in.
The Tahitian woman under the waterfall sort of thing.
But guess what? If you watch any movies about David and Bathsheba, that's what they show. They show this sexy Bathsheba, and it probably wasn't that at all, because that wasn't what ritual cleansing was. And it's very clear to us that it was ritual cleansing. So David looks down and sees her, and then he sends somebody to find out who she is. They come back and tell him, and guess what he finds out? She's the wife of one of his well-respected soldiers. He doesn't stop there. Then he sends messengers to bring her to him. Now, her husband is off fighting his battle. And so he didn't even go meet her himself, but he knows she's married. So he already knows what he's doing is wrong.
And talk about power dynamics. Because he is the king. She can't say no.
Well, and here's what he does. He sends messengers and says, the king has summoned you. What do you think went through Bathsheba's mind? My husband has died on the battlefield. The king has summoned me. Oh my gosh. Isn't that a natural? Nobody thinks that. But I feel like, having grown up in a military community, and every time we saw a car pull up in front of an official car pull up in somebody's house, we all lost our breath a little. That's exactly what she would have thought. Oh my gosh, my husband has died. And she summons him, he summons her, and it is power play after power play after power play, and she has no choice in the matter. And people will argue, oh, she could have said no.
How?
And be killed.
Yeah. How?
Yeah. Yeah, and so it is, and then it goes even more despicable from there. And he ends up manipulating and having Uriah, her husband, killed, and because she becomes pregnant. He wants to try to make it like it's Uriah's kid, and it goes there. And then what happens at the end? People say, "Oh, well, they got married." Okay, was that her choice? Because what it actually says is, when the mourning period was over, he brought her home to be his wife. Did she have a choice in that? No. She was pregnant. He was trying to save face. And they lost the baby, which is another part of the story. But then she does have a baby later, which is King Solomon. And he follows his daddy example on how he treats women.
Family tradition. Yeah.
And so, again, I think it's a story of power, manipulation, and not recognizing that the woman's voice was not important or heard at that time. It's also a story of how we change the narrative to make it look like somebody is more innocent than they really are.
Yeah.
And doesn't that happen today?
Yeah.
Don't women fall victimization to that even today more times than we can care to even
what were you wearing?
Yeah.
Like
how did you look at him?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so
why were
unconscionable.
Why were you out that late at night? I mean, it's
and
constant.
then in the story, she has Solomon, and then the story, we never hear from Bathsheba again until David's deathbed, when she says, I want you to make Solomon king, even though he's not your oldest son.
So she's like, I've done everything that you've told me to, like, make him king.
Yeah. So basically,
there's no love there.
We don't see a relationship.
No.
And we want to make it like, okay, first of all, it was her fault, so there had to be love. And, it's just, to me, that one's a big one.
Okay.
A big one.
So in summary, with these stories, what we're saying is, please don't think of these as love stories anymore. Like, think of these as political power moves, manipulation. I mean, with Bathsheba, we're even saying that was rape. There's rape, there's sex trafficking, there's all of these things. These are not love stories.
Right.
So
we've gotten those out of the way.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's so difficult because those are just a few of the major ones that we know, like that we talk about often or we hear about often. But there are plenty of other examples because it took me a long time to find love stories that I would like, no, this one feels good. This one feels real, because every single one, Samson and Delilah, like all of these different things, there's some sort of manipulation happening. Even Adam and Eve, I wanted them to be a good example of love. And I was like,
well, they only had each other.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. Maybe.
And there's argument for Abraham and Sarah having a mutual relationship. She has a voice.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you still have to put it in. It doesn't read like a love story because there's messiness in there.
Right. And that's the thing, is like trying to find relationships that are specifically structured as a love story. Abraham and Sarah, very possible they were in love, but it wasn't really structured as a love story. It was more of like, hey, historically, here's what happened.
Right.
And they are married and here's their life together. And there are plenty of stories like that maybe they are beautiful love stories. Maybe Elizabeth and Zachariah are a beautiful love story, but we don't know enough, and it's not structured in a way that the Bible is telling us, look at this love story.
Yeah, it's not written in that kind of a narrative.
Yeah.
And because basically that wasn't the point they wanted to get across.
Right.
And so we have to remember that. Why was this story written? It doesn't give us all the facts we need, but what was the point? So there were a few that we found.
Yeah, let's talk about, I didn't find very many. Maybe you found different ones than I do, but do you have any stories that you read through and you're like, you know what? This feels like genuine love?
I felt like the book of Ruth has a lot of love stories in it, more than one. So the book of Ruth starts out with Ruth's losing her husband and her mother-in-law, Naomi, who had also lost her husband. And of course, this was her son that she lost. Wants to move back to her hometown. And she says, Ruth, you stay here and get remarried. And Ruth says, no, I'm going to go with you. Oh my goodness. Mother-in-law and daughter-in-law loving and caring for each other. Mm-hmm. Well, that's unheard of even today.
And then, based on what you were saying, is like looking at the structure of marriage at the time, marriage was not about love. Marriage was about survival. And so Ruth was basically pushing away her own security and protection to be with this woman that she loves.
Yeah. And then Naomi did everything in her power to make sure Ruth was also taken care of, even suggesting that she go to a certain field to glean it to get them food and, all kinds of things. And then along comes Boaz, who is the person that owns the field, and he notices Ruth, and what he does is he makes sure she's provided for. Now, it doesn't give us this, and then they saw each other, and it doesn't give us that. But there is this care and genuineness, even to the point where Boaz does something that, we've already talked about how women are victimized. Boaz tells his servants, if anybody harms this woman.
Yeah. And that's what I put this down as a story I love as well, because Boaz is so respectful and honest and honorable. And so it's not the head over heels love story that we think of in the movies, but it is really reverent and
respectful.
Yes. And he treats her like a human being. He's not seeing her as property.
No, he is treating her with love and respect, and and whether it was romantic or not doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
To me, it is just a beautiful story of mutuality.
Well, and also this is one of the things that gets weird about the story, because there's a there are like legalisms that we don't fully understand today. So it seems kind of icky, but at the same time, it was the law back then. And so I know that, so Ruth was following behind the harvesters in the field to pick up whatever they didn't pick up to provide food for her and Naomi. And as you mentioned, Boaz saw her, asked about her. They said she's picking up the extras. And he basically said, you don't have to do that. You don't have to follow behind and pick up what's left. You're welcome to anything in my field. Nobody harm her. Nobody stop her.
Eat every day with the servants.
Yes.
Take home as much as you need for Naomi.
Yes. So he did that. And then Naomi was like, oh my gosh, what a wonderful man Boaz is.
Well, and they were related. Distant relations.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, because, okay, so one of the things that happen, you talk about women. So like if a brother dies and another brother isn't married, he inherits his
that's right.
his wife and so
Boaz,
on and so forth.
Yeah, so
Boaz is a distant relative.
Yeah, but he was in the line to potentially inherit Ruth as his wife. So Naomi was so like happy about the way that Boaz was treating Ruth. She said, Ruth, you should present yourself to Boaz and ask if you can basically become his wife.
Yeah.
Lay at his feet, and present yourself.
Which means something else too.
Yeah.
And he was honorable in that too.
Yes.
And
so
he said, no,
he did not sleep with her.
Yeah.
And he said, I need to go to who would it
There
have
was
been?
one other person that was a closer
it was like
relative.
A council, though.
But there was one other
to.
person that was a closer relative.
Yeah.
And so he went outside the city gates and presented, he didn't say, I want to marry Ruth. He said, I want to buy to the one that was the next in line for Ruth. He said, I want to buy your land. And the guys, or I want to buy the land of Ruth's ex-husband.
Yeah.
And he was like, and that guy was like, no, I'm the next in line. And Boaz said, oh, okay. But if you buy that, you get Ruth too. And this guy was like, I don't want to.
I already have a wife. I don't want
another wife. Which Boaz was calculating that.
Yeah.
He knew that ahead of time. And then so the man said, you can buy it. So with the field, he inherits Ruth. So it's not as beautiful.
Yeah,
but it is. It was the laws of the land.
Yeah.
And he went out of his way to make sure that Ruth was cared for. And so what we can say is there was respect, there was dignity, there was kindness.
And my guess is that once they were married, because it started with respect and dignity and kindness, I have to believe that love grew between them over time.
When I think of this story, because I tend to put everything into musical theater terms, I always think of Fiddler on the Roof, where there's an arranged marriage between Tevye and his wife. And there's this beautiful song about, do you love me? Because they've never said that to each other. And at one point, she says, we've been married 25 years.
For 25 years, I've washed your clothes, cooked your meals, cleaned your house. If that's not love, what is?
Because they don't really use that language.
Yeah.
And so, it becomes this, it's this great understanding to us of what this was.
Yeah.
And love, I do believe love came, but dignity and respect was very beautiful at those times.
So I think that, to your point, there are multiple love stories in here. So there's a love between Ruth and Boaz, and the love between Ruth and Naomi. And that is more, it's like a familial or friendship based love, because Ruth could have easily, because Naomi had other daughter-in-laws.
Other daughter-in-law.
Okay.
Yeah.
And she decided to stay.
Right.
And Ruth said, no, I'm going with you. Where you go, I go.
Which is no black mark on the daughter-in-law that stayed, because Naomi said, stay, take care of yourself.
Yeah.
But don't forget, today we have a plethora of mother-in-law jokes.
Yeah.
And so it's even an unusual love relationship for mother-in-law and daughter-in-law to care for each other.
I would think maybe I'm wrong, but with the even deeper oppression of women back then, women clung together in a different way.
I hope so. I mean, we don't have that.
Your only safe space is other women.
We don't have that example with Leah and Rachel, but we have it in other places. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I agree.
All right. So one that I want to bring up is David and Jonathan.
I figured you would.
I know. Okay. So David and Jonathan have been up, and this is King David again. So let's just go ahead and say he has his flaws. We've already talked about that.
And Jonathan is the son of King Saul, mm-hmm. who is the king that's trying to kill David.
Yes. And so Jonathan and David, this story is often lifted up as a beautiful example of friendship between two men. I'm not sure about that.
Well, I don't think it matters how you read it.
Yeah.
You can read it as romantic love. You can read it as friendship.
Yeah.
There is no doubt that David and Jonathan had a deep love for each other.
Yeah. I mean, I've gone back and I've read it over and over and over again. And I know that part of it is my view of the world, mm-hmm. but I can't read it and not see romantic love between the two of them. It is poetic, the way that they are in relationship with each other. It is far more than a friendship.
Well, and I think you stated your view of the world. I think there are others that their view of the world would
disagree with me.
And that's beautiful too.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. But Jonathan, it's so complicated because Jonathan's dad is trying to kill David. And so Jonathan is trying as best he can to thwart all those attempts. But they keep coming back together to, it's like, oh, he's trying to kill you again. Let me give you some forewarning. Let me help you. And they protect each other. And when Jonathan dies, David really mourns. He's really grieving. He's really grieving that death. He grieves that death almost as much as the death of his son later on. So it's a deep grieving, which to me also shows a depth of love. We've all experienced a depth of grieving.
Yeah, and I just want to read some of their story. So in their story actually spans multiple books, multiple chapters. And so this is one of the few relationships that it's not just a glimpse, a moment in time. Like we actually see it unfolding over a series of events. And so this is in both 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And I'm in 1 Samuel 18 right now, which is kind of our introduction of Jonathan and David and their friendship. And so it says, as soon as David finished talking to Saul, Jonathan's life became bound up with David's life, and Jonathan loved David as much as himself. And in some versions, it says David and Jonathan's souls were knit together.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Like, this is beautiful. And it said, Jonathan, I'm skipping a couple verses, and Jonathan and David made a covenant together because Jonathan loved David as much as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his armor, as well as his sword, his bow, and his belt. And so it's just this lavishing of love and respect and commitment and honor. And I'm just like, this is maybe one of the most beautiful love stories written in the Bible.
And I think sometimes when we talk about love stories, we don't want to talk about things that are uncomfortable to us. But this is an absolutely beautiful love story. And they would do anything for each other, anything.
And they become each other's safe space. And so anytime that David is seeking safety and refuge, either he finds Jonathan or Jonathan finds him. And over again, I mean, we have two different times where they're making a covenant together and they're protecting each other. And Jonathan is eluding his father so that David can remain safe, and Jonathan ends up dying.
Yeah.
And
in battle, not.
Yeah, in battle. Sorry, not killed by his father. Not killed by his father.
But yeah, and it's just it's a very special story with whatever lens you choose to read it. Don't not read it.
Yeah.
Because it's absolutely beautiful and special, and we can learn so much from it. Because love stories can come in all kinds of ways. I mean, all kinds of ways. We've talked about familial love stories. We've talked about man and woman. There's all kinds of ways to talk about love.
Yeah. Okay. So the last one I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if you have other ones that you wanted to talk about, but
I might have one more.
You might. Okay. I wanted to talk about Mary and Joseph.
Yeah, I think Mary and Joseph is a beautiful one.
Yeah.
And again, it was an arranged marriage.
Right.
But here's something that I think is beautiful. Joseph finds out, this is the line that tells me there was more than just an arranged marriage. There is, Joseph finds out Mary's pregnant, and it says he wanted to divorce her quietly because they were already in a contract of marriage, even though they weren't actually married yet. And he wanted, because guess what? She could have been stoned.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's kind of almost the Boaz story. There's a respect, there's a care, there's an acceptance, there's a I'm by your side.
I don't think I want to marry her, but I don't want to hurt her either.
I don't want to hurt her either.
Yeah.
And then he goes forward, because an angel visits him too, and he goes forward and he is by her side.
Yeah.
We know very little of Joseph's story.
Yeah.
But it is clear to me that he was by her side.
Well, and I don't blame Joseph for wanting to divorce her quietly, because I feel like in modern times, if you are engaged to someone, become pregnant, and that person knows for a fact that is not my child, they might have second thoughts about entering into this marriage. So I get the inner conflict that would come with that.
It reminds me, I mean, think about today, some of those heartwarming videos you see where someone is asking someone to marry them, but instead of just asking the person, they ask their children from a previous marriage too, because you have to love the whole package deal. So Joseph ended up going forward with marrying Mary, and he had to love the whole package deal.
Well, and that's one of the things that I love about both Mary and Joseph, which I think is key to relationships, is a willingness to change, a willingness to change your mind. Because I think that if we get too stuck in the structure of what life is, because Joseph could have easily said, no, this isn't the way things are done. I will be a laughingstock in my community. I'm not doing this. Because you can say no to God. It's not advisable, but you can do that. And
usually something happens when you say no.
I think we all say no to God all the time.
More than we care to admit.
Yes. But he chose not to. He changed his mind and said, okay, I'm willing to do this. And then it was just both of them constantly making sacrifices for the sake of the other. I imagine they weren't seen highly in the community.
No, probably not. And they didn't even necessarily want to move back to her community.
Yeah.
But they ended up doing that. So yeah, there had to be struggles.
So I just imagine them as a true partnership. And even though that wouldn't look the same then as it does today, in my mind, with the way that the community would have viewed them, they probably only had each other to lean on and to confide in and to console in. And so
we're never told how Mary's parents reacted to this.
No.
They're not even in the equation. We're only told how her cousin Elizabeth reacts to it. So yeah, it's like, okay, was she shunned from her own family? There's scripture passages about a prophet isn't honored in his own town and, all kinds of things. So we don't know how Mary was treated.
Yeah.
There was opposition.
But both of them were willing to do what was right despite cultural norms and any judgment that they got from their community. And I think that shows a strong relationship that they're willing to do that.
And we also know there was a strong relationship with Jesus and Mary, and that he wants Mary to be, that was one of the things he says on the cross. Jesus says, take care of my mom.
Yeah.
And so, there's just beautiful.
I wish we knew more about Joseph.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
He the last time we hear of him is the 12-year-old in the temple story.
I can only imagine that means he died young or something.
Well, we don't know even how old he was, and there's two views on that.
Yeah.
We talk about that at Christmas, so we don't need to talk about it now. But the Protestant view is he was a young man. The Catholic view is he was an old man, and this was a second marriage. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't really have any. It's just kind of like, what do you think?
But we didn't even get a sentence of and then Joseph died, which we got with Herod,
Right.
But yeah.
Because that wasn't, again, like we said already, that wasn't the focus of the story.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So when I was in youth ministry, we used to laugh because we would throw out a question to the youth, and the youth would always answer without even thinking, Jesus and God. Because they just thought, well, that's going to be the answer. And it never was, because that wasn't the question we were asking. But in this case, I don't think we can end a podcast, a discussion about love stories without talking about Jesus' love. And Jesus taught us a different way to love. And I think that's a love story in itself. Jesus' love for us, Jesus telling us, hey, go the extra mile. Love your enemies. Love your neighbors. Live your life as a love story. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to recognize that even though we've done all these examples of a love story, we're supposed to be a love story in our everyday life on how we reach out to others.
Well, and I guess that's a good point, because when you think of a more traditional love story, I can't help but think that the teachings of Jesus have changed romantic love, have changed the way that two people connect with each other. Because whether you are a believer or not, I think that there has been a ripple effect of love. There's also been a lot of negativity, but I think that there's just this ripple effect of what it means to love that has changed culturally over time. And I can't help but think that Jesus is a part of that.
We certainly can't uphold Christians as the example of doing right all the time. We can't do that. But what we're
more like King David.
Yeah, we are more like King David. But what we can do is we can say we have been taught.
Yeah.
We have been taught, and we believe in Jesus as our Lord and Savior, and we have been taught how we're supposed to love. Actually doing it is a challenge, but we have seen examples throughout history. There are good examples. Like it is a good example that during the Black Plague, you were more likely to survive if there was a Christian community close to you because they weren't afraid of you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great because they weren't afraid to love you and care for you
and to show up at your house and bring you food and take care of you. Yeah.
We have, equally examples where Christians didn't show up. But so I'm not saying that.
Also, if you were more likely to have a cat, you would survive.
I didn't know that statistic.
It was rats and mice that carried the bubonic plague. And so all of these women that they had been calling witches were surving because they were single women with cats.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
The perks of being a cat lady.
Lover, yeah. So but I do think if we love like Jesus and we walk across the street in love and we reach out to someone who doesn't look like us in love, and we develop relationships in love, that's its own love story. And that's our challenge and our goal when we talk about love stories.
Well, what do you think that we can learn from the love stories of the Bible, even the icky ones?
Love isn't about power. Love isn't about getting your own way. love isn't about self.
Mm.
And I think you can learn that from both the good examples,
learning what not to do,
and the bad examples.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you think we can learn?
Oh, well, I didn't think you'd throw that question back at me.
Well, I also think we can learn that love is messy.
Yeah.
It's not a bow. Even the most beautiful love stories that, the best romantic comedies that tie it up in a neat little bow, it's not.
I don't know if it's as much what we can learn from the Bible, but remembering what we can't learn. So like the messiness that you mentioned, a lot of these Bible stories, you and I were joking about this morning, there's a lot of pieces missing. There's a lot of description. This is not like reading a novel where you're getting the inner narrative of the main characters and you understand everything that they're thinking, feeling, and doing, and that you can feel a part of that story. The majority of the stories in the Bible, it's kind of like beginning, middle, end sort of thing.
I mean, this is taking a narrative that would be a book and making it into a 30-minute sitcom.
Right. And so I think that what I learn about these love stories is that they help me to really ruminate on scripture, to think where is there more to the story? Where can I better understand the culture? And like you said, how marriage works, how the laws work, why this might have been happening, and to insert myself into that story. And I think it takes both. It takes viewing it through a modern lens, and it also takes understanding the context of when and where and why it was written, and marrying those together to be able to better understand what these love stories can tell us.
And it tells us even more about how radical the love Jesus taught us is.
Your answers are better than my answers. That's a really good point, is like, if you're taking the teachings of Jesus and reflecting them, using them as a litmus test over these love stories in the Old Testament and some in the New Testament, we can say, hey, is this true love? Or was this a power play? Was this manipulation? If it's not passing the test of Jesus, then maybe it's not love. Maybe it's something else.
Absolutely. And guess what? We need to do that in our own lives.
Yeah.
And there's so many times that we have an ulterior motive, or we manipulate, or we use our power, or we're greedy. We may not go as far as David did.
Yeah.
But
we'll use the power that we
have.
But
we'll use the power that we have.
Yeah.
And we even say, well, I didn't go as far as David did, so I'm okay.
Yeah.
But we do that. I mean, there are times, and that's true in any situation. I mean, I've been married 40 years, and I think I have a pretty good marriage. But there have been times I can look back that said, oh, I kind of manipulated that situation a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure Chris could say the same thing. And so I think that we're human.
Yeah.
But we need to learn and strive towards loving like Jesus.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on.
There you go.
So, hey.
So love somebody.
Start reading some of those love stories and let us know what you think about them. I'm always really curious to hear your opinions, because we're just sitting here spouting our own opinions for an hour every week, and I like to hear, dissenting opinions from my own. I think it's interesting, and it broadens my mind to think differently.
And I want to challenge everybody to, and I think Alyssa already said this, but I want to end with a final challenge to read the Bible with a grown-up lens. And
read the Bible with a grown-up.
Read the Bible with a grown-up lens, and don't ever be afraid to ask questions and ponder and wonder and go, I didn't know that was in there, and get with somebody else and talk about it.
The Life Plus God podcast is hosted, written, and produced by me, Alyssa Robinson, and sponsored by Treach Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. If you live in the Flower Mound area, I invite you to stop by and see if Treach could be your new church family. You can learn more about all of our programs and events at tmumc.org, and I hope to catch you next week for our next episode of the Life Plus God podcast.